can one say when required to introduce someone who is not only a mentor, an advisor, a cherished human being that seeks beyond the human condition other than to say, Dr. Max More. Max is a scholar. He's an Oxford scholar with expertise in philosophy and economics. He also is the author of The Philosophy of Transhumanism. But along with that, he stretched his brain into critical thinking and practical optimism to come up with the concepts of morphological freedom and the Praxionary principle, two very important tenets to thinking about the future and ethics and risks. Max is the former president. He's known as the ambassador and president emeritus of Alcor Life Extension Foundation. With no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Max More. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm frustrated. Actually, I'm angry. My father died. Two of my best friends died. Both my brothers died. Lots of other people died. Roy Walford, one of the pioneers of gerontology, also died, ALS. Chris Hewitt, another anti-aging researcher, died. I'm getting really tired of this. We need to kill death. This is not just my problem, it's everybody's problem. We're becoming extinct, one by one. We've got to do something about this. The only way we're going to do something about this is having a massive groundswell of support for research into anti-aging. We have to stop this abomination that's aging and death. Now, you're probably like me in that you've probably had conversations with people and you've tried to explain why, falling apart is a bad thing and dying in misery is actually a bad thing. And you're puzzled because they don't seem to understand. They resist. And you think, how can it be so difficult to get this idea across? Why is it so difficult? So I really want to talk a little bit about how I try to persuade people, because that's something that's absolutely critical for us to be able to do if we're going to stop this appalling abomination of aging and death. I'm not going to go into the specific arguments that you hear all the time. I call these arguments the silly seven, because you always hear these silly arguments, right? There's always the argument from boredom. Oh, we'll be bored if we live so long. Well, my response is always, well, you're probably a boring person. That's the problem. Then there's the thought, well, how am I going to plan for millions of years right now? It's another stupid argument. There's the argument that life will be drained of meaning. There's the argument that society will stagnate without people dying off and being replaced by new people who don't know anything. There's the argument that entropy means it's impossible to make progress. Another foolish argument. There's the argument that we have a problem with population and resources. And finally, of course, well, wouldn't there only be for the rich? That old standby, unreflective argument. Now, one kind of theme of what I'm saying is many of these arguments are not really arguments. They're not really things that people actually believe. It's just things that people have been programmed to say in response to the kind of things that you're trying to argue them into. So I think you have to approach these by understanding that you're talking to someone who's not a logical, rational person. None of us are purely logical, rational people. That's not how we get convinced of things most of the time. You need to attack this argument from a number of different directions. And recently, or just a few months ago, I had to really think about this carefully because I was invited to do a debate at the Oxford Union. And you may know the Oxford Union has prime ministers and heads of state and lots of top people debating. And you have basically 8 minutes to make your case. And I was given the motion, this house would live forever. Of course, there's problems with that I'll get to. But one thing that's kind of interesting they do at the Oxford debates is they take a poll before you start and another one afterwards to see if there's been a shift in the votes, because if you just vote afterwards, you don't really know how people changed. So before the debate, only 29% were in favor of live forever and 71% opposed. After we'd finished, it switched to 59% in favor with 41% opposed. That's a 30-point switch. And I got an email from one of the organizers saying, this has almost never happened before. We never had such a huge shift in favor of one side. So I think that was partly because I thought very carefully about how to pack my points into those 8 minutes, not just using logic and reason, but by giving some other arguments, which I'm going to get to the triad, the basic 3 ways of approaching arguments. But first of all, and I feel motivated to do this because I've already seen this happen today, there's a problem here if we use the word immortality. We've already seen this come up in previous presentations. And I would like to suggest that we avoid that term. It's an unfortunate term because, first of all, it actually has different meanings. It can mean inability to die, so no matter how much you might want to, you're not allowed to die. That's not a good meaning, and most of the mythological stories about immortality tend to have that meaning. There's also the problem that in many people's minds, they think of that, oh, I won't be able to die no matter what, no matter how miserable I am, and they separate that from the idea of vitality. Of course, when we talk about life extension, we're talking about the extension of vital life. There's something classic. I mean, Aubrey, who's going to give his talk next, he's written a little piece on this, and we've discussed this idea that there is the myth of Tithonus. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Tithonus era. This was a situation in which one of the gods who had a human lover asked Zeus for eternal life for this person, for Tithonus, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth. And so this poor guy couldn't die, but he got older and older and more bent over and more withered as time went on. And that's the kind of horrible, horrible myth we have associated with the idea of immortality. So I think we don't want to avoid the word immortality, partly because we don't even know if literal immortality is possible. That's something we'll have to figure out in the next few trillion years to see whether the universe supports literal immortality. What we want is indefinite lifespan. We want to choose how long we live. So let's stay away from immortality. It has too many other implications that I think cause a problem. We can't make the press stay away from it, unfortunately, because they keep falling back on things like immortality and forever. It's really about choice. It's about you choosing how long you want to live and not having that imposed on you by the blind whims of nature. So that's one thing, one reason to start. You don't want to put up obstacles before you even begin. Now I'm going to talk about the role of the 3 classic things that Aristotle put in rhetoric. Okay, there's logos. Logos is basically reason and logic and evidence. That's good stuff. You definitely want that, and you want to be true and honest. But it's not enough. You also have to appeal to people's feelings, pathos. That's really critical, and knowing when to mix these in at the right time is very important in debating these issues. And then there's also ethos. Ethos essentially is credibility. If you're arguing with somebody, you want to present yourself as a credible party making the argument. So you need to be able to paste these things and interweave them in a way that's effective. So for instance, in saying that you're against aging, people may hear that and they may get the wrong impression of what you're about. Why do you want to do that? Isn't aging a good thing? Isn't it normal? You're some kind of rebel against nature. That's a bad thing. Well, point out what that is that you're against. Aging isn't just a word. What you're against is the progressive loss of resistance to disease, growing infirmity and disability. These horrible things, the loss of function, the growing collection of aches and pains and sagging skin and lack of sexual function, and all those horrible things that go downhill. That deterioration is really horrible at any age. I should know. I used to be 7 feet tall and 300 pounds of solid muscle. Now, I've shrunk down to just 6 feet, and I'm in this very weak condition you see before you. Now, I know. It sucks. I can tell you at 57 it gets harder and harder, so it's a problem. Also, what is the motivation for doing this? It's not just that we want to be against something. We're actually in favor of something. When people often say, well, are you afraid of dying? Well, hell, I'm afraid of dying in a miserable way, choking on my own fluids or dying in pain of cancer. Yeah, I'm afraid of that. I'm not actually afraid of death because literally there is nothing to be afraid of. Death is just non-existent. So how can I be afraid of nothing? I won't be there to be, to be vexed about it or annoyed or irritated or uncomfortable. I just won't be there. So I'm not afraid of being dead. What I'm afraid of is the loss of possibility. I'm afraid of the loss of life and opportunity, the ability to develop myself, to create, to contribute, to make things better. So that's what life should be about, and aging and death take away from that. So in saying you're against aging, what you're saying is you're for life, you're for all the good things in life. And we're in this ridiculous situation right now where from the time you grow up, from the time you're born, as you grow up, you start off really vigorous. In fact, when you're young, you're probably too vigorous for your parents. You're a bit of a pain in the butt. You're running around and making a lot of noise and getting into trouble. But you don't know anything. You're really pretty ignorant at that age. So as you get older, your level of knowledge and wisdom, hopefully, not in every case, should go up. If you make any effort at all, it should go up. But at the same time, at a certain point, your level of vigor and energy goes down. So this is going up and this is going down. That's kind of a ridiculous situation. That's a real design flaw in the human condition. Why can't it be that as you get older and accumulate wisdom and knowledge, you also increase vitality, or at least maintain it, but maybe increase it as we get more and more technological developments that allow you to increase and enhance your intelligence, your physical well-being, your resilience, ways of boosting your immune system, of hardening your skull so a truck can roll over you and it's just a minor inconvenience. Why can't we have these things going up together? Somebody did a very bad job in the design, and we need to fix that. So let's talk about these three ideas of logos, pathos, and ethos. So I think many of you probably naturally tend towards the logos end of the spectrum. You're probably pretty rational argumentation types. You probably like to point to the evidence and explain why you think something's possible and to respond to people's objections with facts and figures. And that's all very good, but again, it's not really going to be enough. You have to break through the resistance that people have. And to break through that resistance, you need passion and you need to be credible. And you also need to understand what is the real resistance here. What actually is really concerning these people, again, is not necessarily what they're telling you. There's a growing body of psychological literature that studies this, that looks at what reasons people give for their behaviors. And you could actually do clever experimental designs which show you that actually is not really the explanation at all. There was some other explanation. And really, we kind of make up reasons for what we do a lot of the time. And so many times when people say, well, I think, we shouldn't do this because only the rich will have it, or we'll all be bored, they're probably just coming up with something post hoc to explain something they've been brought up to believe, which isn't really necessarily the reason. So you have to kind of try to be aware of that, and you have to look at the person you're conversing with and really see, are they just kind of spouting that, or are they looking really upset? Try to read what's going on, and which are the real objections you need to deal with. Is it some kind of personal fear that they wouldn't know what to do with the choices, or is it a real issue? One thing you can, when it comes to, I've given you some pathos points. Basically, when I started off complaining about all the people who've died, who I've lost, that was some pathos. And actually, in the debate I gave, I kind of started off trying to establish my credibility and also using some pathos to explain why this mattered to me, why it was something very personal, not just an abstract argument. Well, a point that kind of combines the pathos, the feeling, with the logos, the logic and reason, is something that a lot of people may not be that aware of. Again, looking at psychology, we can see that people, as they get older, as they live longer and acquire some wisdom, their personality actually changes in certain fairly predictable ways. And these are generally quite positive ways. So, for instance, we tend to gain in 3 of the big 5 personality traits. There's the big 5, which is kind of the most popular psychological theory of personality these days. We tend to become more conscientious. That is, we do what we say we're going to do, which we're not so good at when we're younger. We tend to be more agreeable, we get along better, and less neurotic. So those are good things, because a lot of people have the idea that as you get older, you become a waste of space, and you're pretty useless. That's actually not true at all. And we can think about also, imagining a world in which people live a lot longer. Who are the people who commit the most violent crimes? Is it your 95-year-old grandmother? No, it's usually teenagers and people, and especially men in their early 20s who have too much testosterone and don't think about the future very much. So there's actually a lot of benefits to the wisdom that should come with aging, hopefully, in most cases. I had a stepfather who didn't seem to have much of that. He didn't really seem to learn much as he got older, but hopefully that's the exception. Also, we tend to find that over time, people get better control over their emotions. Antisocial behaviors go down as people age, along with levels of the so-called dark triad. Sounds great, like dark triad. It sounds pretty scary, and actually it is pretty scary. Those nasty qualities, Machiavellianism, which is based, from Machiavelli, manipulative behavior, manipulating people, that tends to go down as people get older. So does narcissism. It's all about me. That tends to go down. And so does psychopathy. Psychopathic behavior tends to go down with age. So that's pretty good things. That's something you can point to. If people think that old people are just a burden, of course, they're already making the mistake of thinking of old people as old and not having energy.
Can you hear me?
But to show there are actually some benefits. There are some things you lose a little bit as you get older because of a worsening health. But our whole point, of course, is we want to have good health as we get older.
You're on
so you
mute,
won't lose those
Jose.
good qualities of
I see
openness
you're on mute.
and extroversion, which tend to go down with age. How am I doing for time? I didn't start my timer, so am I?
You're on mute.
Well, I'll just keep going until someone stops me. Another thing I find kind of interesting when you're talking to religious people in particular,
So
and I
now-
can come back actually to religion in a minute too. What's really weird to me is people, most people who think that living indefinitely or forever, if they think of it that way,
Your audio broke.
is a bad thing. Many of those people believe in an afterlife. So they don't have a problem with afterlife forever or after living forever. Somehow that's okay.
Okay.
I've always found that kind of puzzling because what do you do when you're in an afterlife? I've never actually heard a description that sounds appealing to
me. We are going to go
me.
with you maybe in 10
Either you're in
minutes.
the bad place, which obviously isn't any fun at all, but nobody thinks they're going to the bad place. They all think they're going to the good place. So what's the good place like? I can't find a very good description. You know, you're sitting on a cloud playing harps, or you're just kind of basking in front of God,
I didn't touch anything,
doing
but
nothing.
now it's.
You have
can
no
you hear me? Now
activity,
you're
no creativity, no productivity.
Yeah, you
I don't
hear
know
me
what you're
now,
doing.
but
It
now
sounds
you're
awfully
frozen.
dull to me. But they don't seem to have a problem with that. So why should they have a problem with living indefinitely in the real world, or in the physical world here? Especially if you can choose to terminate that life at some point. If you've had enough after 3,000 years, you can always check out. So, you know, again, going back to the original idea of you can't die, immortality, that's not good because maybe at some point, you know, you said, okay, I've done it all. I don't think that's ever going to happen personally, but if it does, you should have that choice. Also, an important thing to think about is sometimes when you're debating someone or conversing with somebody about this idea of extending life, you're not necessarily trying to change that person's mind. You may already realize that that's just hopeless, it's not going to happen. Or if it does happen, it's not going to happen right now because almost nobody says, you know what, you're right, I'm just completely wrong. How often does that happen to you? Not very often, right? They might come back a year later and they've changed their mind and they say, oh no, I've always believed this. We see that sometimes. Could we have less conversation at the back, please? It's quite distracting back there, please. I don't have forever to talk, so I want to get my points across. So think about that. You may be not talking to the person, not primarily communicating to the person you're actually talking to. You may be talking to other people who are listening, whether it's online or in an audience. Like when I was doing the debate, officially I was debating the other people on the other side, but actually I was really talking to everybody else who was listening, a much larger group of people. So you have to really think about how they're perceiving things. For instance, back in 2002, I appeared on Crossfire, which is an American show which gets people together to debate, kind of pretty hot debate on major topics of the time. And this was actually about cryonics. It was after the baseball player Ted Williams was cryopreserved, and they had in a so-called bioethicist, I think it's a very unethical bioethicist, but bioethicist Jonathan Marino to critique cryonics, and I was supposed to defend it. And his strategy consisted entirely of deriding cryonics, of making fun of it, of dismissing me, of saying, well, that's like trying to jump from here to the moon. And my response was, no, it's not. And I kept pointing out that he had no arguments. And I was giving arguments, and I made sure the audience knew that, because I knew I wasn't going to convince this idiot. He is already fixed in his ways, but I had people listening, so I kept pointing out, you've given no arguments. I've argued that cells can survive cryopreservation by giving them the proper treatment and so on and so on. I was giving arguments, and I wanted to make damn sure the audience knew that. And it worked, because when I left the studio, some of the technical people said, you know, you really crushed that guy, even though they had no particular reason to be sympathetic to me in the first place. So he was not really the person I was trying to convince. It was the other people listening. And to me, it was important, therefore, to frame what was going on and to make very clear to the audience that I was treating them as rational people with good arguments, and he was not. Now, be prepared to respond to those main objections. Again, I'm not going to go through the silly 7, but if anybody has questions about those, you can email me and I'll point you to some very good answers to those objections of boredom, that you have to plan billions of years ahead of time, and that life will be drained of meaning, that will be stagnant, that entropy is a serious problem, we don't have enough resources, and it's only for the rich. Those are the silly 7. There was an interesting survey when we're thinking about, you know, what actually are people really thinking when they say, no, I wouldn't want to live any longer, that sounds miserable. What people are actually thinking, there was a survey by the Pew Research Organization, that's PEW. They do a lot of surveys, you know, every week you'll see a new one from them. But this was in 2013, and it's the only one I've seen actually asked any decent questions. And it was quite interesting because, well, first of all, going back to religion, what was quite interesting to me was believing that there is no afterlife do not make people more favorable to the idea of life extension. That might be surprising. You might think, well, people who think this is it and then I'm gone, that would motivate me to actually favor life extension. Apparently it doesn't. So don't think the religious people are going to be more hostile to this idea. They're not necessarily. In fact, it seems to be the other way around, certainly in regard to both the cryonics and life extension in general. I find more objections from people who don't particularly believe in religion. Many of the religious believers it doesn't seem to really bother them that much one way or another. And of course, you can also make good arguments from their point of view that, let's say they're a Christian, you can point out the people in the Bible who lived for hundreds of years and say, we just want to get back to normal. So if they take that seriously, they shouldn't be concerned about living more than 100. So that was one curious thing. Also, it turned out that people were very optimistic. By 2050, a fairly large majority, I think it was a fairly large majority thought that we would actually have an average lifespan of like 120 by 2050. Well, that's actually pretty optimistic. I think even maybe for quite a few of us here, that's pretty hopeful. So they were optimistic about that happening, but they were not very favorable to it. That's the kind of curious thing. They also had a very interesting disconnect between what they thought other people would want and what they personally would want. So 68%, more than 2/3, said they thought most people would want the treatments that would give them a drastic extension in lifespan, but 56% were against having that personally. So they thought everybody else wanted it, but they wouldn't, which is kind of interesting. There was also some good questions which basically asked people about the associations of life extension with other ideas. So if you associated medical treatment with better quality of life as you aged, that increased the chance that you favor life extension. So again, that brings us back, it's very important not to assume that people understand what should be obvious, that we're not talking about just living longer, we're talking about living longer in increasingly good health and reversing aging, because people just don't get that. It doesn't, it makes me bash my head against the wall, it's so stupid, but of course that's what we want. The more people understand that, the more likely they are to be open to the idea of life extension. Also, and this is kind of curious too, maybe this explains, well, I don't know. The more that people associate longevity with productivity, understand the idea that if you live longer in good health, you'll be more productive, the more people were in favor of the idea. So even though they say they don't want it for themselves, it seems they have this kind of a collectivist attitude that if it's good for society by producing more stuff, then it's a good thing, even if I don't want it. So again, quite curious. So also argue, as I did in the questions earlier on, that you need to be able to make the argument, yes, living longer in good health will increase productivity, increase economic growth, make people better off, give us more opportunities. You need to be able to make that argument. That's something which you can, if you Google the longevity dividend, you'll find some good arguments along those lines. This is also a very good one for politicians, by the way, because of course, they don't really care about you. They care about votes and what they think they can buy votes with. And if you can tell them, well, look, you can reduce taxes and reduce national debt because you won't have to pay out so much in retirement and social security and all kinds of other benefits because people will still be healthy and productive, then you might get their attention. And I think that's just beginning to happen a teeny bit right now, especially as we see societies like Japan and Germany and increasingly more and more European countries, especially in Eastern Europe, with declining populations and aging populations. Actually in China too, surprisingly, they have the most rapidly aging population of all. So they're going to have issues with that too. So if you can make an argument that it will be economically beneficial, I think you've got a chance of influencing the people who influence the research and also can stop the research, as they tend to do. Now, not surprisingly, also, the older you are, the less likely you are to favor life extension. Not really surprising. If you're healthy and fit and you feel pretty good and you're having sex 5 times a day, yeah, I want more of that. If you're a lot older and your back is hurting and you've got broken discs in your spine and you've got constant headaches and you've got some cancer problems and you've got increasing depression and your brain is not working as well, it doesn't seem so appealing. And it's hard to remember what it was like to feel good. That's a real problem. So that's not really surprising. So although we see these numbers that most people don't like the idea of life extension, the more they associate it with health and vigor, the more they're in favor of it. And I think also what that will mean is as we actually make real progress and people actually start to see people living longer and healthier, which we're beginning to right now, that resistance will tend to crumble. Because again, the reasons people give are bullshit. The rationalizations. If they actually see people being healthy and enjoying life at 70 and 80 and 90, they'll think, maybe that's not so bad. And to expand that to a broader transhumanist perspective, This is one of my favorite little stories, a short story, which I have to tell you about because most people haven't read it, and hopefully it's online somewhere. There's a great little short story by Mark Stiegler, that's with a C, M-A-R-C, called The Gentle Seduction. And I love this story because it's just perfect. And it illustrates this point quite well on a transhumanist level. The basic idea of the story is this guy, the guy in the story is one of us. He's a transhumanist. He understands how things are coming about in the future. His girlfriend is pretty skeptical about this stuff. She's not really against it. She's not really that interested. And he ends up dying. He didn't get cryopreserved for some reason. Fool. But he doesn't. But she goes on, and she starts to get older. And, she's in her 60s or something, and she's going skiing. And she sees the ice about to collapse, and someone yells a warning, and they get out of the way. And she said, "How do you do that?" He said, "Oh, it's my infrared vision implant." And she goes, that seems like a pretty good idea. And then, she starts getting a bit older, and she can't really go hiking and mountaineering and skiing anymore because her back is hurting. And so I said, "Why don't you take this little pill, these nanoscopic devices, and they'll go rebuild your spine?" And she goes, "Well, that couldn't hurt, could it?" So she takes the pill, and now she can go back hiking again. And one by one, without any kind of ideological drive to do these things, one by one, she basically becomes post-human. She overcomes aging and death, and she actually becomes the first person to make contact with an alien intelligence. So it's got a pretty grand ending like that. And I think that's the way it'll be, that as we actually create these technologies, people will become more and more favorable to them if they see that they're actually good and beneficial. But to get to that point, we need more support. We need more people in favor of this. And to get to that stage, you need to get better at arguing. I'm going to keep getting better at arguing. I get a lot of practice, though. But you need to sit down and think, well, it's not just I need to go do my research or send some money to this foundation. I need to get good at convincing people this is a good idea, because we need more people supporting this. So spend some time thinking about that. Who do you talk to? How do you talk to them? How can you do a better job? Think about how you combine your credibility. How do you present yourself most credibly? How do you use passion to convey this, as well as the logic? Now, it may not happen in time, so I'm saying with Natasha, make your arrangements for cryopreservation, because you may not make it long enough. You never know what's going to happen. But we need to build up team life, the people in favor of this stuff. And to do that, you've got to argue well. You've got to argue for your life, and you've got to argue effectively. So that's really my message. Go out there and do it. Build up team life. We have to win this, or else we're all dead. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? I have no idea how long I took, so.
We're timing you. Why don't we take one question from the audience? That must be the way it's done. Anybody? Down there.
Thank you very much, Max Moore. I'm just thinking the last thing you said about that we have to argue about to win more people for these ideas of the longevity. What about the argument that, let's say, if we look at the theory of evolution, that, like, let's say after 100 years, a person has to die, and then they are newborn children, and this way a species is improving itself. And now against that is like with longevity, saying that we live forever. That means it's more like the technology that helps us improve and that makes us perfect as a human being. What would be the answer if somebody argues with this, like with the evolution, the theory of Charles Darwin?
Well, yeah,
what would be the
problem with
answer?
evolution is it's extremely slow. It works on very long time scales of many, many, many generations. So if we wait for evolution to improve us, we're going to have to wait for an awfully long time. I mean, our brain hasn't really changed much in 100,000 years. It's probably changed in some pretty minor ways. So I don't think that's a very good way of improving the species. You're going to have to wait a very long time to see that. Technology evolves at a much more rapid rate. And so if your concern is that we're going to stop evolution from making improvements, well, yes, we are, but we're taking over at a much more rapid pace where we can actually directly change our genes. We can maybe put in artificial chromosomes that you can put them in as a child. When you're an adult, you can choose whether or not to activate those chromosomes or give you new capabilities. You can decide whether to put in implants. You can re-engineer the brain. For instance, maybe you feel like you just don't understand your emotions very well because we didn't evolve to have pathways going from the emotional centers to the rational centers, or rather the other way around. We evolved to see a threat and immediately feel fear and react to it. We're not very good at understanding where those emotions come from. If we could build neural pathways, that would take, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to really happen by evolution, or it may never happen because evolution isn't guided. We can do it much more quickly. So I think the argument, that we're slowing down evolution, I think is quite backwards from that point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Question over there.
My name is Laurens. I was wondering, what do you think is the bigger obstacle for life extension? Is it societal challenges or scientific challenges?
Societal changes or scientific changes? They're kind of hard to disentangle because the way society isn't really a thing, but the way most people think and believe will affect the kind of scientific research that is done. So there's obviously a very strong interplay between those. By people like us having our conferences and events starts to drive people's interest in actually doing the research, and hopefully that will then, if people hear about that in newspaper reports and news coverage, they'll start to maybe rethink that, and society will gradually shift. I don't know. I'm not sure you can put one ahead of the other. They're so interconnected that it's very hard to say. In some cases, I think technologies very quickly drive a change in society. In other cases, maybe the other way around. I mean, I think a case of the former was the birth control pill, which, once that was available, it pretty much rapidly changed the way people interacted sexually and so on, that very rapid change. In other cases, we see, I think, social change happening very quickly. You can think about how quickly people become tolerant of transsexuals, for instance, which is not really based on any scientific change because we still can't really change sex that much more effectively than we could 30 years ago. So it's very hard to separate those two things in this case. But I think that having a real demonstration of longevity, which is a problem with humans because it takes a long time to show those results scientifically. That's why animal results are important, and other ways of demonstrating through aging clocks that we're actually making progress. That should have a powerful effect. But again, that takes some time. So that's why I think we can't wait for the scientific progress to produce results, because that may not be visible for several decades, really. We have to make the argument in the meantime, because otherwise it'd be too late for many of us.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That is our esteemed speaker, Max Moore. Max, as you probably have gathered, is one of the great futurists of our day.